here's what we're going to jump into today. So first, we're going to talk about a roadmap. So a roadmap is an offering that we do for our clients, and something that I suggest that people look at doing, where it's basically a shorter engagement where you do some of these pre-kickoff activities and you also start thinking about where you're going to go long term. So I'll talk a little bit about what a roadmap offering is and why that's important. We'll talk a little bit about change management. So what is change management? Why does it matter as it relates to your project? And what are some things you should be thinking about? And we'll talk about your project charter. So how are you going to run this project is typically included in something called a project charter. So making sure that you have a good plan for that, knowing what elements go in there, what are all those decisions that you have to make sure your project charter looks good. And we'll just talk about some strategies around managing tasks and managing schedules. When you're doing an ERP or CRM implementation, there's a lot of stuff going on. How do you manage it all? So a couple ideas there. And then we'll talk about the actual kickoff meeting. So what are you looking for in the kickoff meeting? What have been some successful things that I've seen in the past that have really worked well in kickoff meetings? So if we go back to last time, we talked about our proven process, the align, define, create, deploy, and power part of the project. Today, we're really focused on the define phase. So last time we talked a little bit about the discover and demo portion of it. This time we're really refining on the team, the scope, the schedule, budget, the how do we work through the process of implementing this business application successfully. So I mentioned our roadmap, and the roadmap is an offering that we started providing to clients about 2 or 3 years ago. And really, we talk in implementations about this thing called the cone of uncertainty. So the cone of uncertainty is basically saying, if you do an estimate, if you ask me to give you an estimate on, business application, say we're going to do an ERP implementation for a, make to order manufacturer, what's that going to cost? And I've been asked that question in the past. Like, well, I don't know, somewhere between $100,000 and $5 million. Well, I am incredibly uncertain at the point that I'm answering that question, right? I don't know anything more than just a very small amount of information. And so oftentimes when you're going through the sales cycle with a partner, implementer, vendor, they will become more aware of what's going on. They'll understand how many companies are involved. What are some of your core processes that are in scope? What's your team's level of commitment to the project? All those type of things will actually start to reduce the cone of uncertainty. And then, but by the time that you go through a couple demos and a couple discovery sessions, there's still a lot of unknowns. There's still a lot of processes where the details are not very well known. And so those things are uncertain. And so if you're giving an estimate on how long it's going to take to implement those things, it's really challenging to do that. And the accuracy level is going to be low. Now, by the time you get all the way through the project and you've done joint process designs and you've done conference room pilots, you have a pretty certain idea of what the scope of the work is, how long something should take. You can give a much better estimate in terms of how long it's going to take to get completed. So throughout that process, it's like, how can we try to reduce the cone of uncertainty to get as accurate of an estimate as possible? So that's one of the key value propositions of doing a roadmap. It's digging in a little bit deeper to make sure that that estimate is as accurate as possible and that you have the right game plan to make sure the implementation is going to go more successfully. So the roadmap a lot of times is really trying to take this part between buying the software and getting to the kickoff meeting and use that as a time to understand how you're going to run the implementation. What are the things you need to be thinking about? Let's dive into the details on some of the custom areas or pain points that you have so we can get a better estimate. So this is an example of this cone of uncertainty, right? You start at the start and you ask a very generic question. I'm a professional services firm and I want to have a great CRM system. How much is that going to cost me? Again, I can offer a guess, but it's not going to be a very good one, right? If we spend weeks together going through detailed design of everything that's going on, I can give you a more accurate guesstimate, or I can give you an estimate that I feel confident in that you could then budget based on and set expectations with your team that that's going to be a good number. So that's really what we're trying to do here. And so throughout the roadmap, we do a lot of those activities I talked a little bit about last time, but it's taking a next level deeper in that. So what is the vision? What are the success criteria, the value that's going to provide? Let's take those 13 core process categories and let's go a level deeper into what's actually going on. Let's talk about how do we lead through this change. So I'll talk about that more today. Now let's really get into the detail of who's on this team, right? You might have said, oh, my business process owner for financials is our controller. So they'll be, she'll be in charge of everything you need there. Well, what happens if you have a very detailed, AP related question? Is she going to know the answer to that? She might not. So who would be the person on her team that could answer those questions? So it's, again, going a level deeper. Let's talk exactly about the technology that's involved. How many integrations are you going to have? Who's on point to really understand those integrations? Do we have contacts with those organizations if we need to build integrations between them? How are we going to think about exchanging data? Are there portals or other places you need to present data as well too? Let's really dig into that. Do we have the right performance and scalability for this solution, or are there future parts of the organization that might take advantage of this that we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner and prevent that from happening in the future? And then talking through the planning and governance. So again, who's the overall executive sponsor? Who's the project owner? Who are the business process owners? What is our cadence for meetings? And a lot of this stuff that we do in the roadmap is something that you could say, let's figure all this out, and maybe we don't like Microsoft Dynamics. Let's take it to a NetSuite or another provider. The intent on this is really for this to be useful information that could be taken anywhere. And it's also an opportunity for, we think of it as a try before you buy kind of opportunity as well too. So again, whether you use a partner like us to do a roadmap or another provider, I think it's a great opportunity to understand how they're going to operate within the project and see if they're a right fit for you, and then you can make the decision from there. So I recommend a roadmap, regardless of what product you're talking about, as a great way to get value from understanding how they're going to operate the product, having them challenge you on how you're going to need to be set up to run this project successfully as well. So then what's included in the roadmap? So there's typically an assessment report that is the ultimate artifact or production that comes from that report. And inside of that, you're going to have a program roadmap. And just a quick aside on the difference between like a program manager and a product manager. So program manager is typically the name that you use if there are multiple projects going on. They're typically managing a whole program full of projects. So that's a confusing thing for people. I thought I'd mention that. So this roadmap articulates more than one particular project. And then the project roadmap is each individual project inside of there. What is the roadmap for those? Hours estimate, licensing costs, and then ultimately a presentation and recommendation. So that's the kind of thing that you would want to be looking for in a roadmap to make sure you know how all of your projects that are associated or go together are going to come together here. So now let's talk about change management. So if you think about a project and you think about all of the people that might be touched by implementing an ERP or CRM or any kind of business applications, it's a lot of people. Even last time, and just putting up the people that might be involved in the project, there was 12 names on that list. And that's not even getting into a lot of the people who are going to use it every day. So there is a significant amount of change that's going to happen as you go through these projects. And it's really important to think about and understand who your stakeholders are. And I think about that as like grouping your people into different groups of how they're going to experience the change. And then one of the things you can do to be successful is really tailor your message to each of those groups, because they're all going to experience change differently. So your executives, leaders are going to experience change. They might be getting different reporting than they had before. They might be able to do more things in terms of take on new initiatives faster because they've got a better platform that they've had than they had before. But they also will be hearing about this implementation process. They might have budget impact. So they're going to experience change in different ways. Now, the people managers who are managing the team members going through this are going to be, their team might be working extra hours. They might be making uncomfortable decisions. They might be resisting change where you might have to then, as a people manager, help them through that process. So there's going to be change there. The employees and users of the project are certainly going to have change if they're using the product at all. There's definitely going to be change in their work. The project team, they're going to be the ones leading a lot of the process change as we go through this, and leading the team through all of this activity that's going on. So they're going to obviously be experiencing a lot of change, and how they deal with it and represent it is going to reflect on your organization. SME subject matter experts, their day-to-day is going to change. The things that they've done for 30 years might now be different. On a Monday when they come in, they might be doing something completely different than they've done before. That can be really difficult. IT is going to have to support these folks in a different way. They're going to have to be set up to take help desk requests from these folks doing something different. They might not be able to answer those questions. They're going to have cloud solutions to support as opposed to maybe hardware to support. And then all your operational teams. So again, the people that are supporting these folks may have changes as well too. So whether that's your HR team or your finance team or your sales operations team, all of them are going to have to change. So one of the best exercises you can do is think about the groups of who will experience change and who are those distinct groups that will experience change on the project. Identify them as stakeholders and then try to think about what are they going to experience on the project and how can you help lead them through that. That's really when you want to boil down change management, that's really the way I like to articulate to people so they really understand what's going on. If you give one message to everybody like, oh, this new solution is going to improve our ROI by 25%. Well, the executive leader's like, yeah, great, let's do this. The individual who's using the software is like, well, I don't care about that, right? Like, I'm got to do something quite a bit different than I've done before. Like, that sucks for me. So, and then if you say, well, the message of the whole company is, well, the user experience is going to be better. We're going to be able to save some time here, in three different processes that we're doing. Well, the team member might be, okay, well, that sounds good. I still have to experience change, but at least it's going to be better. But then other folks might miss out on the value of it as well. So again, customizing your message to the different audiences is really key. So there are kind of 3 steps that you go through as you implement change management on a project like this. So first is preparing for change. So that's that whole stakeholder alignment thing I was talking about, is who are those different groups of users and how are they going to experience change. So once you set the strategy and vision, that's really the next thing to do. And then who are your sponsors? So who are the people with an understanding of change management who can help support these different stakeholders? And then what are the risks? I mean, the risks oftentimes are people just don't want to change, or people might not even suggest a new way of doing things because they're so resistant to change. What are you going to do about that? That's a risk that you have on the project. How are you going to work through it? How are you going to work through one of your business process owners basically saying, I don't care if you do it this way in the product, I want to do it the old way, and it's 360 hours of customizations that you have to do to the system. How are you going to handle that situation? So those are the types of risks you need to be prepared for in the beginning. And then the next plan is outlining your plan for managing change. So what is your stakeholder engagement plan? How often are you going to be talking to those various groups? What are you going to be communicating to them? How are they going to be trained? How are you going to manage them or handle escalations? That's kind of the sustainment plan portion of it. And then what is your cadence for the execution of that plan? And then finally is just making sure you're ready to reinforce that change. How do you gather feedback? How do you take corrective action if the corrective action needs to be in place? I mean, if you have somebody in your organization who's completely resistant to change, and no matter all the tactics that you've tried and just will not move forward with you, are you prepared to take the action of saying, well, maybe that person's not a fit for our organization and where we're going? Again, you don't want to have to do that, but that might be a better solution than moving forward with someone who might be a cancer as this new solution comes out. So those are all things to be thinking about on the change management side of it. And if you prefer to think about it as just people management, and if that helps you to consider this as well too, that's another way to look at it. So ultimately, all of this stuff really is just the process, tools, and techniques to manage the people side of change to achieve a business outcome. That's really what we're talking about here. So there's the technical side, right, of the change that's happening. There's the people side of change, and each time you have to walk them through the reason for it. And what is the current state? What is the transition state? So what are the meetings they're going to be coming to, decisions they have to make, and then what's the future state? And that's how you get to success in this. And I wrote about this in chapter 7, sorry, but there's really 9 things that I think are really key to make things successful as you go through the project. And the first is, and you'll hear me say this a lot of times, but making sure the leadership team is truly aligned and all on the same page. Again, I've seen so many implementations where the leadership team is not actually really aligned. They may say they are in meetings, but then they will do things to, they won't follow through on their team's commitments, or they will, say this is a bad idea after the leadership meeting. And that really, really hurts the project. If the leadership team is aligned all the way through, they are making their team available to get these projects done. They are supporting their team as they're working longer hours. They are available to help make decisions as we go throughout the project. If all of the leaders are doing that, you're in much better position to be successful in the project. The next step to be successful is this organization evaluation. So who's all involved, who are the stakeholders, and what kind of information do we need to share with them? And then another thing that I think is really key is, how are you going to make that decision about changing business process? So you are going to change business process as you go through this implementation. How are you going to make that decision? So is that decision just going to be the business process owner is just going to say, this is what we're doing now? Is it going to be something you have a meeting about and then the decision's made? Is it going to be something that we've had implementations in the past where it's meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting in order to try to drive to consensus, which never really comes? Again, that's going to delay your project, and you're for sure going to be over budgeted on your project if you take that tack. So again, thinking about this ahead of time is going to really help you. And then what is that system vision? So again, continuing to paint the picture of where we're going and how this benefits each of the stakeholders. And so that can be one really impactful thing, is if you can communicate the benefit to that particular stakeholder group who's going through change and remind them that, oh yeah, this will allow you to do things faster, or you remind them that you're going to have a chance to get better information than you had before. I know this is painful, but here's your benefit. And then make sure that the communication that you have with those audiences or stakeholders makes sense to them and that they're going to act on them. Again, you all probably get lots of emails and lots of communication in various different forms, some of which is actually something you take and use, and some of it is just noise, right? So making sure you understand how will the users actually respond to that communication? Is it being done successfully, or is it getting sent out in a company newsletter, on page 4 that nobody reads? And then maximizing the time in the new system. So I'll talk next time about the joint process design and CRP process that's really designed to try to get people into the system and using it as much as you possibly can. And making sure you've got a good training plan so that they know and feel really comfortable about how to use the solution. Set realistic expectations for go live. So this is another key thing where if you tell them this is going to be, the world's greatest system, everything's going to work perfectly, you're going to have reports, at the tip of your finger, just set realistic expectations. So one of the things you can do wrong is say that this is going to be the world's greatest solution. You'll have everything immediately. If you do that, you're setting yourself up for failure. And then make sure you support your team members after go live. So the go live day is usually a lot of fun, and everyone's all over every user trying to make sure that everything's going well. And so there's a lot of attention that's paid right away. But some of the most challenging time happens 3, 4, 5 weeks, usually when the first month end has to happen, where team members still need support. They might be running into bugs or challenges or not knowing how to do something in the new system that wasn't specifically trained. Making sure you've got resources available for them after go live is something I feel like gets less attention than it should. So if you do these 9 things as you start this project, you're going to be in a much better position. So now let's shift gears and talk about a project charter. So what is a project charter? What goes into it? So the project charter, think of that as like the code of conduct, or here's how we're going to run this project. It's like your overall guide to running the project. So the first thing you put in there is these project goals, success criteria that you've talked about. You also try to refine as best you can the scope in the project charter. And you want to also include what's in scope and what's specifically out of scope, because what oftentimes happens on projects is somebody comes up with a good idea for something that might be useful now that you've got this new platform, and so they will try to put it in scope. But that kind of takes away from your ability to execute on the project goals. So clearly identifying what's out of scope is very helpful and should be in your project charter. The team and governance. So who is your executive sponsor? Who fills each of these roles? Who makes decisions? What is your cycle for leadership or steering committee meetings? What is your cycle for project team meetings? How often are they communicating? And what is their escalation point? How do you escalate things to the partner? And making sure you have a good relationship there to be able to manage through that. What's your overall communication plan? So not only the meetings, but like status reports, email messages that go out. Again, who are those audiences and how often do they need to hear from you? What's the project schedule? So what is the target schedule for this implementation, and how will you be managing and adjusting that schedule as need be? And then one thing that oftentimes gets overlooked is how do you manage change requests? So there will be some amount of change requests on just about any implementation. That might be de-scoping something which doesn't have any dollar or time impact. Could be adding something to scope that does have dollar and time impact. It could be an estimate that was 80 hours is now 400 hours. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to push back your go live to be able to accommodate that? Or are you going to change the scope and come up with a workaround? Again, making sure that you have an understanding of how you're going to do change requests. That should be in your project charter. So let's talk about what are some of the best ways to do communications on projects. So I certainly recommend a weekly status report, and you can really get this weekly status report done in a few different ways. Obviously, you want to send out an email or communicate that to whoever is interested in hearing what's going on. You want to be able to do a green, yellow, red on your budget, on your scope, on your risk register, on your resourcing plan for it, and just an overall green, yellow, red on the project. So that should be something that your project manager does on a weekly basis. And then it's a matter of how do you want to have other communications going on. So generally, there should be a full project team meeting on a weekly basis where the project manager then updates the status and then goes through any plans for the next week, resource changes that might be happening in terms of people being out of the office, or availability changes based on your day job or whatever else you might be doing. What are the key things that are going to happen this week? What are the key things that happened last week? So those types of meetings are important. Leadership meetings should be occurring, or project sponsor syncs should be occurring on at least a monthly basis. I think 2 weeks is a good time to be getting your leadership team involved, or you could dictate that based on the status of the project as well too. But if your leadership is really going to be bought in and helping with it, whether that's a steering committee or a leadership team meeting, getting them together and actively involved in the project really helps the success of the project. I'm a big fan of stand-up or scrum meetings for the project teams. So that's a 15-minute meeting every day to go over what your 3 questions. What are you working on? What did you complete, and what do you need help with? So those are the 3 things that you ask in those short but sweet meetings. I joined one for a client one time. There were 24 people on the stand-up meeting. I said, this is not how you do it. It's got to be a group of like 10 or less people on those meetings. So sometimes you might have to have 2 different groups doing stand-up meetings and then using your project manager to communicate between the groups. And then if you're going to use sprints, which I'll talk about in a second, the sprint planning, review, and retrospective. Now, again, you can combine those with project management meetings, but those particular meetings are very helpful. And then you've got to be willing to set up project-oriented meetings. So it might be a joint process design meeting. It might be a design review meeting. It might be hey, we have access to the subject matter expert for purchasing, and we really need to pick their brain on how we need to do that. So you're going to have those other meetings in there as well. But in the project charter, you should be setting up these top 6 meeting types here. How often are you going to have them? Who's going to be included in those meetings? And what are the goals for that? And then this project sponsor sync is really like the implementation partner and your executive sponsor getting together on a regular basis to just make sure that anything that needs to be addressed at that level can be addressed quickly. The sooner you address those items, the better your project's going to go. So project schedules. Project schedule is a really important piece that needs to go into the project charter. So I am a believer in using project or even Excel Gantt chart to be able to map out your high-level activities of what's going on in the project. You don't want to get so detailed in your project schedule. Like I've seen 900 plus line item project schedules, and that gets really hard to manage. So as I'll mention in a second, Azure DevOps is a better way of managing tasks, but Azure DevOps isn't very good at outlining an overall project schedule that you can show your leadership team. So a project schedule to me is more of a high level, like we believe with this much work and this many resources, this is the project schedule that we can achieve. It should be somewhere around 100 lines in your project schedule. Again, you can use project, you can use Excel if that is better for you, but you should try to align those big buckets to where you have sprints. So let's talk about what a sprint is. So a sprint is really nothing more than a period of time, right? It's a consistent time-boxed iteration, which can be oftentimes either 2 weeks or 4 weeks. My preference is being shorter, like having 2 weeks. And so within each of those sprints, that's how you divide up your work. So we've got 80 hours of time. We are going to get this much done during this 80 hours. Then at the end of the sprint, you look at how do you do and what do you need to get done in the next 80 hours. And so sprint is really nothing more than a segment of time. But the value of that is you evaluate progress according to these sprints, right? You could have a sprint that's daily and try to evaluate progress every day, but then your project manager is just going to be overloaded with tasks. You could have a sprint every 8 weeks, but then you almost go too long without reevaluating how things are going. So that's why I prefer 2 weeks. Here in our here at Stoneridge and our IT team, we decided to implement a 4-week sprint. So, less project management activity, but also potential for bigger variance in terms of how things are getting done. So that's the debate that you have. But sprints encourage accountability and transparency. That's really what they bring to the party, is you have a better idea of what's getting done, and you have a better opportunity to hold people accountable to meet their commitments. So in a sprint, you manage what's called a backlog. So there's a product or project backlog, which is all the work you have to do on the project. And then what you do is when you do your sprint planning, you take a chunk of that product backlog and then you assign it to a specific sprint. So you say, okay, we've got 1,000 things to do. In the first sprint, we're going to get 100 things done. So it's kind of this list of work that provides value to the product or project. Anyone can add something to the backlog, the overall product backlog, in terms of anyone can put an idea out there. It's up to the project manager to work with the overall project owner to queue up what's priority. So if someone has a crazy idea, you can still put that in the list. You just put that down as priority 4. And then throughout the project, as you get 4 things done, you might add 4 new things to the back. And now those are no longer in the backlog, but now you still have just as many things as you had in there in the past. Now, hopefully, you're whittling down your backlog, you're prioritizing your backlog, and you're assigning that backlog task to various sprints. But that's one of the challenging things a project manager needs to do early on the project, is build out that project plan and organize the work in these different sprints according to what's overall in the backlog. So here's how a sprint works. So in this case, this is a 2-week sprint. And you'll see this is sprint 4 in our hypothetical sprint plan. So in the beginning of the sprint, you do what's called sprint planning. And that sprint planning is organizing what are we going to get done in this 2-week period. Who's going to be doing what, assigning those tasks out, making sure you have estimates on that task so you know how long those are going to take. So there's work that comes before sprint planning to make sure you're set up to be able to make decisions quickly there during that time. Then you have daily stand-ups throughout that process. So those are your check-ins to make sure things are moving on time. And then at the end, you do a sprint review. Okay, what did we get done? Did we get done everything we said we were going to get done? Usually the answer is not at 100%. So what is your goal in terms of what percentage of sprint expectations are going to be met? It probably should be 90 to 95%. And then you can also do a sprint retrospective, and that is really a looking back at, like, how did we do this time? Did we not set right expectations? Do we have one person who's not performing very well? Did we forget about a company meeting on the Thursday of that week, which messed us up and put us behind? So a sprint retrospective can either be combined with a review, but the idea is you should be getting feedback on what you could be doing better than the next sprint. So those are the core meetings that go into this Agile or Scrum model for managing sprint activities. So project activities, these are just the types of tasks that you want to be able to manage within your DevOps. So you want to organize your work by process categories, kind of mapped to epics, and then you have features that are mapped to process groups. And then you want to assign your tasks to each of those relevant areas. You also want to assign your bugs there. There's an opportunity for you to manage risks and issues in DevOps. Change requests also can be identified in there. And then DevOps does a good job of managing the code. So the changes that are going in are all something you can manage within there. So DevOps, it's called DevOps because it's really the combination of development and operations. And so that's why you'll hear that that's a universal term that's not specific to Microsoft. But Microsoft has a product called Azure DevOps. And there is a learning curve to DevOps. If you haven't used it before, I do suggest you go through training or ask your partner to provide some insight on how to use it. It is the best tool for being able to manage all of the tasks that are going on in an implementation. If you're a small business client, or if you're doing a quick CRM implementation, you might not want the overhead of using DevOps. In that case, you should come up with a Excel or SharePoint-based task management system. But again, if you're doing any kind of sizable project, I highly recommend you use DevOps for your tracking. And then within DevOps, there are a number of different tools you can use to really report on progress. So there's a Kanban board in there. You can also do queries and export them to Excel and show them in Power BI, which we do a lot of. There's dashboards you can build in there that show progress really well. But I encourage you to kick that stuff out to Power BI and try to report that way as well too. It looks really good on your status reports. Does a nice job of giving people an understanding of where you are on the project. And then finally, estimating and change requests. I mean, estimates are really a key to success in being able to manage your project. You need to know how long stuff's going to be able to take. And then as a project manager, throughout the project, you need to be looking at some of this estimating tracking. So estimate to complete. So estimate to complete is the amount of work you have left to do in the project. So if it's a 500-hour project and you are 250 hours burned, how many hours do you have left to get done? Now, it's great if the answer is 250. Chances are the answer isn't perfectly 250. It might be 300, it might be 200. So what is that estimate to complete? That's something a project manager needs to be able to represent throughout the project so you know if you're tracking the budget or not. The estimate at completion, if you know your estimate to complete, the estimate at completion is pretty easy. It's just how many hours have you burned plus the estimate that you have to complete. So again, if we're 250 hours in and there's 300 hours left, that puts us at 550. If our budget's 500, we got a problem we got to talk about. And then one of the things in more advanced ways you can do this, and they do this often in construction, is your earned value. So what is the value of the work that's been done to this point? Have you completed more tasks than the associated budget was during this project? If so, great. Have you completed less tasks than the associated budget had with those tasks? Now you've got to okay, are we going to have to cut something out, or what can we do to gain more efficiency? So this is the kind of value that a project manager would provide throughout the implementation. And if something is off track, that's when you go to a change request. So again, it can be used if something's scoped in or out, and it might be a $0 change request based on that. But if the budget needs to be changed in any way, then you need to make sure that all the parties agree to that. And then I highly, highly recommend that you deal with change requests as quickly as it's possibly foreseen. So if you get yourself 4 or 5 weeks into the project and you're way over budget, your budget is much higher than the earned value, you've got a problem. You got to try to tackle that as quickly as you can. And maybe it's just you operate in a more efficient way and you can come in on budget, great. Or you take something out of scope, you can come in budget, great. But the sooner you have those conversations, the better off you're going to be. All right, the final thing I wanted to cover is the kickoff meeting. So the kickoff meeting is the official start of the project where you get everybody in a room and say, hey, we're doing this, here's our timeline, here's why we're doing it. So it's a key point to kind of get everybody excited about where the project's going. So make sure that you've got that set up well in advance. Make sure you've got anybody who's going to be involved in the project invited to that meeting as well too. So these are typically pretty large meetings. It's good to have the partner on site with you, but it's really key to have executive engagement. So whenever I organize these, I make sure the CEO or some leader within the business is there talking about why he or she is excited about that project. So that really goes a long way from a change management standpoint to get their endorsement into the project as well. So that's something I insist on whenever we work on a project. And then make sure you get feedback afterwards, make sure people understand what we're trying to do and why. And then it's a great opportunity to do a team building event too, is these people are going to be working on a project for 9 months together, locked in the same room. Like, let's make sure we've got good relationships going into that. So again, executive overview of the project. Then you go through these introductions. Who's doing what? What's their expectation? How is the project charter? What are the rules that we outline in the project charter? What is the project schedule? And then what tools are you going to need to use? And then sometimes it's also good to do an overview of the product during that as well too, just to kind of get them comfortable with, here's what you're going to be looking at over the next many weeks as we work on this project.